Hey babies, it's me again. Today we're going to be using 6-pound fireline with the color white because we're doing light colored earrings. Here's a size 10 bead needle. It's pretty toe up from the flow up, but you know what? It still works, so I'm going to use it. So here we go. I will measure out about 50 to 60 inches of this polyethylene gel-spun bead thread. So we're going to be making a single break stitch earring, but with the foundation being one bead all the way across, which is a single stacked break stitch. So we'll be starting with only 2 beads because each bead will represent one column, much like the bugle tutorial that I posted prior to this. So if you haven't done that one, I would highly suggest that. And I would also suggest that you go ahead and familiarize yourself with just a regular brick stitch in any of the other tutorials I've made, because this is going to feel a little wonky if you don't. It'll feel loosey-goosey, all those things. You're going to feel a little unstable, and I've set this up so that you can build upon that foundation. So as you see in the upper left-hand corner, I've showed you we're basically doing the same thing as we did in the bugle bead, but this is going to feel a little less secure. So as you see here, I'm holding on to the beads in between my forefinger and my thumb. I think in the description box, I will mention that this is more of an intermediate, beginner/intermediate video instruction, because I'm creating this video based on a foundation I've laid in the previous videos. So please check out the first, second, and third brick stitch videos I have posted. And if you feel brave enough to bypass the bugle bead tutorial, then I commend you. So as you can see, I'm working very, very slowly, methodically, and carefully. I think those all go hand in hand. So as you notice, I'm working a specific colorway. It's the colorway that's advertised. It's my design. However, if you'd prefer to stick with a single color your first go around, I definitely support that decision. If you want to go with my colorway, then just refer to the chart that I've provided in the description box below. So as you see, with each of these guys, I alternate, just like the other videos. So if the string is coming out of the top, you work in through the bottom of the bead. If the string's coming out of the bottom of the bead, you work through the top. And because I'm kind of going a little faster in my pace with how I'm explaining certain things, because I assume that starting this video you have a pretty good grasp on fringe and break stitch and weaving in ends and things like that, I'm gonna go ahead and fast forward, or however, what do you call this? Speeding through some of the motions that you would most likely be familiar with by now, and I have taught over and over in my previous videos, so that you can just have kind of this visual refresher. Some of the spots I slow down on the points where you have to add a new bead to a new row or weave something in. Some key moments as I was learning, I would sometimes have to refer back to instructions. So if you want to jump into this and you feel somewhat familiar but you haven't developed a lot of muscle memory, this should be a pretty good crash refresher course thingamajigger. So here we have all the established beads for the foundation row, and if you see, there are one bead next to each other, not the double or triple. Even though in the first tutorial I ever showed you guys, I worked a double stack as the foundation because it's a lot easier, and for beginning you want something a little more stable. However, for this one, you're working it just like I did the bugles, where it's one bead next to the other. And in this particular one, this design has 12 beads for the foundation row. So that tail at the beginning of our work is going to be pointing upwards into the row that we're working in, or the side that we're working into. You'll see when we come to it. I cover it in the triple break stitch, but I will cover it here again because I want you to feel confident, and I don't want you to have to feel like you're about to lose your first bead in that foundation row when you get to it. So as a little refresher, at the beginning of every row, we always work 2 columns. So in this particular case, in the beginning of each row we're going to get 2 beads, and we're going to work into that second little stitch. So here's the third one, and I'm working the colorway. So again, feel free to do whatever you want. If you print out the chart and have all your beads ready and everything in place before you start weaving, it'll be very easy to refer to. And I've also made a video on all the essentials that you need, and then maybe a couple of extras once you get established that helps you go through this entire process a lot easier, setup and cleanup as well. So I'm going to speed through this a little till we get to the end of this second row so that you can see how I work it. And again, even if you've been doing this for a while, let's say you've made quite a few of the types of earrings that I showed you in the previous videos, and this is kind of something new you want to work, it's good to remember to pace yourself. You can work slowly. Haste makes waste, they say, right? So as you see here, I'm holding the beads firmly between my fingers as I'm working the thread with the other hand. And just work gently because it's going to want to pull on that very end where you establish the first row. So there you go. And just tug and hold it in place and tighten that thread as best as you can. And here with that little end guy, you can weave them through kind of like a premature weaving in of the end, so to speak. I just leave it because about halfway through this third row that you've established here, or we're about to establish, you'll feel that your foundation feels a lot sturdier. That's why I do a lot of times like to work a foundation row in 2 or 3 stacks because it just feels more secure. And here I'm just going over again visually. I won't explain everything. I just want to be able to re-show you visually how to start each new row. So here I'm going to skip to the very last 2 rows that we're going to do. So when you get to the point where you have only 3 more beads on your row, we're going to work 2 more beads, which will be our last row. And from here, this is where I like to go ahead and create the loop for your ear wire. There are several ways to do this, but I'm going to use seed beads for the loop. There are thread protectors. You can use a Fringe clasp, it's like a closed clasp, and a jump ring, a soldered jump ring, like I used in the bugle bead tutorial with the diamond shape. When I worked this end right here, I used a jump ring before I worked those last 2 bugle beads. That will ensure that the jump ring is not going anywhere and the earring's not going anywhere either. But for this particular one, I like the way the seed beads look, so I'm gonna stack them 3 and then 3. So total, there will be 6 seed beads for this loop. So here I have my 6 seed beads, and I'm gonna work down into that next seed bead, the second one, all the way down the edge of the entire woven piece along the bias. And we're gonna come out the other end where our foundation row is, where we first established the first 2 beads. See the little tail? So we've worked almost completely in a, well, this is like a horseshoe shape. But once we start our next row along the bottom edge of our foundation row, we will start to make that diamond shape like we did in the bugle bead tutorial, which is why I did that one first, because the bugle beads are much easier to deal with when you're trying to get this one under your belt. So same as every other row, you start with 2 columns, and in this case only 2 beads. And maybe you can kind of see now how I like to establish that loop, which would be the top of the earring here. Because when we weave in the end at the very, very bottom, you're not going to want to be messing with that loop and weaving in that end. It just seems to be quicker for me. And so you'll work your color pattern as the chart shows, and feel free to switch up the colors. I was going to do all warm colors, but I don't know, I just felt like if I was going to work the fringe in white, I wanted to make the woven piece as colorful as possible. So here we're at the end of our second row on the bottom half of the diamond, and it pretty much works like every other. So this is why I like this thread, because boink, there it goes. It doesn't hold that knot when you're trying to work with it. So now you're ready to work the next row. Pick up your 2 beads and then just work back and forth all the way till you get to the very tippy top or tippy bottom, which will be 2 beads left. So here it looks pretty crazy in the colorway. And here I have my second to last row, which has 3 beads. So I'm going to grab my last 2 beads. So here we'll work down that edge. Instead of making the loop, we just go straight into that bead and work all the way through the edge, the bias edge. And I came out of the foundation row here, and I'm gonna work up a little bit just to tighten it. And then I like to come back through the loop to reinforce that loop there that's gonna be hanging on the ear wire. The ear wire will not break this gel spun thread. It's very, very strong. But for safety measures, I like to reinforce it. And to kind of close this off, or round it off, I suppose, I like to work into a couple of rows down or up and then weave in so I can close off that foundation row. I like to squeeze that foundation row to both sides of my diamonds or triangular shapes that I've worked. And then here I will just work in a zigzag right down the middle of the diamond. And you'll see why. It's sort of planning out for any ends you're going to have to weave in. So if you can keep it right in the middle, that's most ideal. So to get it out of the way, I'm just going to go ahead and weave in that first tail that we created. And I'm going to use the big eye needle since it's a very short tail. It's much easier to weave in. I've demonstrated this in other tutorials, but to round this tutorial out, I'm just going to go ahead and show you how I do it. And I've mentioned before, on single brick stitch, weaving in ends can be kind of a pain. It's easier to work through those double stacks or those triple stacks. So you just got to be a little patient with it and don't force it. Choose the path of least resistance if you can. And then work that zigzag, baby. Et voila. So now it's time to work the fringe. I like to use all-purpose sewing thread, but many bead folks use 1G and the like. I think you should try everything out and see what suits you best. So from here, I'm working at the top and I'm coming out of that foundation row, that first bead. And I like to leave about a 1/2 inch tail, maybe 1.5 inches. And I don't weave it in. I like to just kind of loop it around the top in between the beads so it's secure enough to where I won't lose my tail, but it leaves room for unweaving if I have to do such a thing. So I'm working 40 beads down per strand, and because they're on the bias, it'll have sort of a natural uneven edge along the bottom. But feel free to work only half or a third. It all depends on what you prefer. This is fairly longer fringe. I like long fringe. So I'm going to work up the strand, but I'm not going to come up into the foundation bead that I'm working out of, if that makes sense. You'll see. See here, instead of going up that bead, I'm just coming out of my strand of beads. And normally you would work it up into that foundation row, each column of beads, but for the bias, we're going to do it a little different. We're going to go down into the next bead. These first few strands are going to seem a little loose, or you'll feel like it's not looking right, like it's not looking full, but I guarantee you, just be patient, and when you get about halfway down your bias edge, you'll start to see the way they fall and the way it flows, and it's really nice. And these first few strands, I just really tweak them to my liking. And so as you can see, we come out of the woven piece, out of that foundation row bead, and then we come back up and then we go straight into the next bead. We don't go back up into that first bead that we're coming out of. That's very important. I've tried to limit my number of passes through any given bead so that you can prevent busting a bead if you have to weave through it several times, which sometimes that happens when you're weaving in ends. So here I want to mention in the fringe, I purchased some glow-in-the-dark beads, and I've been wanting to use them, and I tried and failed miserably, and then I just put them in my drawer and didn't think about them for like legitimately a year. And my friend inspired me to use them again when she did this really great pair of earrings, or like 3 pairs of earrings, where she did kind of like this psychedelic pattern with it, and then she worked the glow-in-the-dark beads into them, and I really loved it. So she inspired me, and I did my own kind of version, I guess. Well, they're very different, but she's my muse for this pair of earrings. So you can get crazy with it, or you can work this fringe as one solid color, or if you want, you can take the lead from the woven piece and you can just follow the colors. It's really up to you. So now, as you can see, I've worked quite a bit of the fringe in that pattern, and so I ran out of thread, because that will happen. And so what I did is when I came up through that strand, I worked directly back into the bead that I came out of. Basically did what I told you not to do at the very beginning, but that's because I'm weaving back up. So I wove that piece of thread all the way up the bias edge that I just worked all of that fringe through, and then I brought it back up the top bias edge where we first came down. And so here I'm poking out. So this is where I'm going to weave in this in the top half of the diamond of the woven piece, which is why I wove in the gel-spun thread across the middle of the earring, because we're going to weave in ends up top and we're going to weave in ends down at the bottom. And with these earrings with the fringe that works along both bias edges, if you think about it, it's basically working 2 earrings into one. So you have your half portion of woven earring, and then you have your fringe. And so we're basically weaving 2 triangles and then 2 sides of fringe. So it's technically using the same number of beads for 2 earrings, but in 1 earring. What I'm saying makes sense, I promise. And if you followed that, thank you, and I'll feel less crazy. So here I'm using the big eye needle to weave in this tiny little tail, because it'll make your life a lot easier. So now it's time to start a new strand of thread. So here is where the weaving in of ends gets tricky and why I like to plan it out. I'm going to start this new strand from the midpoint of the diamond into the bottom, and it's going to come out of that green bead at the bottom, as you can see. So when it comes time to weave in all the ends, I can weave this end at the bottom, in end at the bottom, whereas I've already worked a couple in the middle and at the top, save for that last little tail you see that will go into the top. So you can see here it's very important to come out of that first bead. So we have those 2 beads at the bottom, so we work 1 strand out of each of those beads. So it's like the only 2 strands of fringe that sort of behaves the way the straight flat woven does when we work across that foundation row. So here we go. up that one. And so I will work directly into that bead, that green bead, instead of working into the one next to it. I like to think of them as like my two little legs, and then all the fringe on the bias are like wings or something. So like that, and then you work down into that second bead like you would if this was just straight across the foundation. But since we're not working across the foundation and we're working along the bias, it's gonna behave differently, except for these two little guys. I would rather over-explain that than under-explain it, but I hope my direction along with the visual aid is sufficient. So we will work this last strand of fringe, and we're using the same concept for the second edge, but instead of working down the bias, we'll be working up. So as you see, we're gonna work up into this second bead before we start the bias. Just want to show you. So there it is. And we're gonna come out the top of that bottom bead. If I can get it in there. There we go. See, just like that. And so this is how it's going to be poking out. And then you'll just work the fringe as usual. Just like that. I wanted to show you what it looked like. It looks kind of wonky, but I promise it's not. It's just like that guy. Those guys. So you'll work all the way up to the bottom of that foundation row, and that will be the last strand that you work coming out of that little spot that I just stuck my fingernail in between. So here when we work up the bias, instead of working down into the next bead, we're going to be working up into the next bead, just like this. Get in there. Perfect. So now we're at the last strand. It's going to be basically coming out between the foundation row and that second row from the bottom. And this is where we will work up into that bead, that last bead we worked of the foundation row. We're going to work up into that guy. There he is. All the way up the bias edge. It doesn't matter too much how far you go up. I like to go all the way up, but you don't have to. But I would suggest to go up 4 to 5 rows. And then, as always, work that fringe. Twist them back and forth, tug on them, twist like the strands together, and then you can twist the beads individually along the thread. So here, you're just going to be weaving in all your ends. I have them poking out exactly in the positions and the spots that I want to weave, basically start weaving them back and forth horizontally. I trust that you can handle that and that I won't have to drag you through weaving in those ends, because it is not fun. It is not fun at all. And if you're going to practice, I'd rather you practice and not watch me do it sped up. So here I'm using sterling silver ear wires. This is my last one I have, and so I'm using it. The other one is reserved for the second earring that I make for this pair. So get those pliers. I've listed everything you need in the description box below, and gently move it. Pick the side that you like. I like to weave everything in on one side and then have the front side showing. That makes sense. The side that I don't weave all the ends in, that's the side that I usually put on the front. Either way though, if you're good at weaving in your ends, it won't matter. And let's check out the glow-in-the-dark beads and see how they turned out. Ooh, I'm definitely using more next time. I hope you enjoy this.